would like to thank everyone. I know that I'm probably not as enticing a talk as Robin, and I know that we're all going to miss out on accessibility. But we have something a little different here. I gave a version of this talk as the keynote at Swiftcraft this spring, and I gave it at iOS Conf in North Macedonia. Both times I got good feedback on it. I'd thought about submitting it here, but I'm also a part-time grad student. I do freelance work. I'm very busy. I didn't have time. And so, of course, 48 hours ago, when I found out that there was the opportunity for me to help out and speak, I decided to completely redo my talk from scratch, make it completely different, and that's a terrible idea. But here we are. So if there's an award for least technical talk, I just might win it today. This isn't as much for indie developers, but this talk is very much for those of us who have to play well with others, especially at large enterprise companies. I don't know if this has been happening to you, but for me, it seems that tech is at an inflection point. The landscape is shifting around us. AI is fundamentally changing how code gets written. And the pace of development is increasing, or at least tech debt is increasing faster, and the pressure for us to ship things is happening faster. And if we move too fast without thinking it through, our mistakes compound faster. So what I can say is that change seems to be the only constant. The discipline, like the lines between disciplines are blurring faster than ever. In some organizations, we're seeing fewer designers. We're not seeing as many product managers. Or we're seeing product managers just produce more AI slop at a faster pace. All of these changes, unless they're thought through, have downstream effects for developers. So my perspective is that you can't do your best work unless you're set up for success and have context for things that are happening around your app. One thing I do suspect is that systems thinking is a wise thing for all of us to invest in, and maybe storytelling. So who am I to talk about this? I have worn many hats. I have been a designer. I've been a developer. I worked my way up to tech lead. Then I decided to become a product manager, went back to design, and eventually became a design leader. I've worked at tiny companies from about 5 people. Masterclass, I was employee number 3. I was a UX engineer there when we launched. And I've worked at 50,000-person corporations, really big enterprises. And the last 6 years, I've specialized specifically in strategy for native mobile. I did this at Lululemon, helping scale their mobile org from 1 team to 3 teams, and at Atlassian across Trello, Jira, and Confluence. I also spent a year at GitLab that wasn't native mobile, but I was working on the experience strategy for their planning tools, which, shocker, developers are the #1 user for. I think a lot about how to set up software teams for success. So this is me in about late 2022 when I got reorged off of Trello onto Jira. It was a little bit of an identity crisis for me, and it seems that the state of design in tech, this is happening to a lot of people. I don't know if you follow Lenny's newsletter, but in his survey that he ran this spring, 84% of tech employees are experiencing some form of burnout. So I personally am taking a sabbatical from tech. I'm actually a part-time master's student at the University of Edinburgh in their Futures Institute. And I'm studying narrative futures, art, data, and society. That is an esoteric degree that you don't need to know anything about. What you might care about is that my master's project is how narrative can improve process and outcomes for the software industry. Throughout my career, I've been really lucky. My teams have always thrived. I have a really high track record of success. And this is whether I was the designer, whether I was the tech lead, whether I was the product manager, whether I was the design leader coming in and working across really large organizations. This isn't all just about me. It's not like, yay, I'm fancy. But it's something that I was doing. And this is something that IC developers would eventually call out. They couldn't always name exactly what it was I was doing, but they were giving me positive feedback. The designers that report to me, my peers, both in product and engineering, the senior people up above me. And what was it that I did differently? I told stories. And I don't mean anecdotes or funny what I did for the weekend. I don't mean the kind of stories that you see in Jira or Linear as a user. And not bedtime stories, though I do have a theory that the Three Little Pigs is a great way to talk about app architecture decisions. So what I did is I made sense of the chaos. I created narratives. I used metaphors. I used analogies. And I did this in all of these different roles. And so how do these stories relate to you at this tech conference of Mac and iOS developers? If Soylent Green is made of people, software is made of stories. Every bug report tells the story of expectations versus reality. Every user interface is a tale about how humans and machines interact with each other. And every roadmap is a saga about the future that we're trying to build versus the resources that we have today. Graphs, charts, dashboards, those are just stories told with numbers. So stories shape software at every level, whether you're aware of it or not. And why? Because stories are applications that run on the human operating system, which is narrative. Our minds process millions of data points per second, but stories transform that overwhelm into chunks that we can actually use. The presentations that you're here to watch, they're all very carefully crafted narratives that explain and transfer technical concepts. So, one of that feedback that I was getting from people of like, you do something different, this works, we don't know why, where I'm taking these organizations and turning them around, is that I was using, a lot of times, analogies. Some people will nail it and they'll be like, I love your metaphors. And I don't want to be the pedantic English major and be like, an analogy is not the same thing as a metaphor. Either way, they're taking these very technical concepts and finding a way to explain them. So an analogy is a storytelling hack. It takes existing components of understanding and glues them together in compact but powerful stories. And sometimes this can be very effective to solve certain types of problems. I've found it, especially when there are problems that I walk into an organization and everybody's dispirited because they're like, yeah, we've tried that, we've tried that. And so when I walked into Trello in 2021, the problem that everybody kept talking about is parity, parity. We have to achieve parity, like, we're never gonna do it. And this is something that is super common for anyone who's built apps across multiple platforms, particularly if you happen to be a companion native app to a web-based software, like SaaS product. So at Lululemon, this was disparity between the two apps. So Android was about 5% of our users, and iOS was 95%. And some people would argue, like, but if we invested more in Android, maybe we would get more users. Well, if you do the market research, it's not a Venn diagram of the overlap between iOS and Lululemon. It's just one big circle with like two thin crescents on the side. Investing in Android didn't make sense for us. iOS is what did. So on Trello, it was the native apps to web. So I find in this situation is that people tend to focus on the disparity of it, that they don't have parity yet. And it creates its own disparity within the teams. And so, because the problem is, instead of focusing on the right features to build, they're focusing on the fact that they can't achieve parity. So I'm going to talk about an example from Trello. And so in this example, mobile's one of the tiny dogs, and web is the big dog, giving us a serious side eye. They had all the bones. So Trello was founded as a native-first app. When it launched, it was native. But then eventually it was purchased by Atlassian in 2017. By the time I walked in, mobile had 40 people to web's 250 people. But we had 15% of the resources, even though we were 35% of the monthly active users and 30% of all new signups. A little bit above that, maybe a third of all new signups. We were the slowest org to ship. Our morale was at an all-time low. We were not holding up the quality bar. We did not have a great reputation. And our relationship with web was contentious at best. It was this focus on parity, the lack of prioritization, and the drum that we were beating was, we need more resources, it's not fair. Well, you know how well that goes over if you go to leadership and are like, it's not fair. They don't care. You sound like kids that are fighting over toys. So how did we get out of this world where there's all these surprise API changes coming down the pipeline, creating incidents that make us look terrible, make our customers angry? So this is where I said, what if we didn't chase parity? And everyone said, yeah, we've tried that before. So I was talking to my engineering partner, and I was like, man, I feel like we are the neglected caboose at the end of a really long release train. And then I stopped myself, and I was like, no, we're not. We're not a train. We're light rail. And so I came up with this transportation analogy, because the thing that I found was as I started talking about it, people, they were like, oh yeah, that does kind of make sense. If you think about web and mobile as different platforms that function like these different transit modes in a unified system, it made sense to them because it was something everybody understood, our stakeholders understood. We didn't have to dive deep into the technology. We didn't have to fight over prioritization. That all of a sudden, people were starting to get the idea. And so I talked about these platforms working together like while embracing their unique strengths. And so I'm going to go into that analogy, because if you've been in this position of parity and prioritization, which if you're an indie developer, a smaller organization, iOS only, this doesn't affect you quite as much, but there are still some usable principles here. So my analogy, web is your heavy rail system. It's established infrastructure for SaaS apps, particularly anything Atlassian does, Microsoft, so many different things. You're going to have your desktop apps as well. I guess Microsoft not as much, but you're going to have your web-based apps. I'm not going to go into the nuance of desktop apps versus web in SaaS products. I have a lot of feelings there. I want to see more native Mag apps, but at an organization like Atlassian, that just wasn't going to happen unless we were talking about like Electron wrappers. So even if you're iOS only, you still have a marketing website. You're still touching web in some capacity. So in my metaphor that I'm using on Trello, mobile apps are light rail. So it's like, we're like light rail. We're shorter trips within a city. We're running errands. You could be commuting daily on it, but it is not designed for hauling freight, and it is not for long-distance journeys. And so we were able to focus on those streamlined everyday tasks that people need to accomplish. Mobile web comes up in all kinds of different capacities. I've had different products where people are like, well, like, why do we even need a mobile app? We'll just use mobile web. Sometimes that's the right choice for you. There are a lot of times where it isn't. It's super flexible. There's less infrastructure needed, no App Store approvals, no downloads, but you are compromising on experience quality, because responsive web cannot compete with native mobile on performance, permanence, accessibility, speed, and security. Let's push our metaphor a little bit. AR, VR, that's a thing we're now designing for. That connects to our apps. That connects to all kinds of different things. That's flight in our transportation system. There are new dimensions of movement, horizontal and vertical. You're seeing things from new perspectives. But there is a high barrier to entry. Like airports, you need special terminals and equipment. Headsets, maybe even dedicated space to move around in. And you wouldn't take a flight to go grocery shopping, right? I didn't have time to go into Apple Watch, again, 48 hours, but let's imagine that that's a Vespa. It has its own very specific use cases. So let's continue my analogy to where we kind of continued to evolve things, because I started to get buy-in from people. I started to get people talking about this, to allow us to go into a world where we were prioritizing the right features versus chasing parity. So touchpoints. Touchpoints are those moments when your user actually interacts with any of your transit lines. So an example for app download related touchpoints happen long before your app is even downloaded, like how people walk from their home to the first stop of their light rail journey to the airport. That's going to be email marketing campaigns, search engine results, referral links, website banner ads, blog posts, influencer reviews and recommendations, app store listings. All of these are touchpoints before app download that do affect your app because, fun fact, if people don't download it, they're not using it. App onboarding has some of your most critical touch points in establishing credibility with users. This is where users are trying to buy a ticket and board a train. If they can't, they're going to take a taxi or an Uber. So these are your welcome screens, your account creation, priming before asking for permissions, because we always tell people what we're about to ask if we want to successfully get those system permission alerts. There could be tutorials, feature highlights, or upgrade prompts. Transactions are the core touch points of any e-commerce app. At Lululemon, this was incredibly important. These are the light rail stops through the Museum Quarter in Amsterdam. Add to cart, save for later, select payment method, order summary, shipping and delivery, confirmation email, and even initiating a return. And in native mobile, we have the opportunity to interact with the physical world in novel ways that web alone just cannot compete. NFC tags, store beacons, geofencing alerts, location-based push notifications, augmented reality markers, Wi-Fi hotspots with app-specific landing pages, QR codes on literally anything. So the important part with the analogy is that touch points are stations on these transit lines. And they're really important for you because if you're making architecture decisions, if you're figuring out where to invest, understanding what the other stations on this transit line, especially the most important ones, the connections, helps you make more informed and better decisions. Because if we're trying to move faster, that again, I said at the beginning, our mistakes compound even more when we're moving faster. So these transfer points where the lines connect, on native mobile, we do have those unique handoffs like physical to digital bridges, or we even have handoffs between two different mobile apps, such as in-store technology connecting with app transactions. And this is what we ran into at Lululemon, because the educators in store had their own app, and then our users had their app. So what are the cool things that happened were those two transit lines, two light rails coming across each other within the same city. This was really cool that I was able to design the wish list, that I had it where in-app somebody could create a wish list, they could share that wish list. I collaborated with web. I actually changed the web experience by them adopting a lot of the patterns from the native experience, making it stronger, versus them doing it on their own and handing it us to downstream and a mobile app trying to retrofit to make it work. And one of the cool things that I was able to do was, all right, there's a QR code for this list. So that means either I could take my list into a store, or even better, somebody who knows me who wants to buy me something but doesn't know Lululemon particularly well, they could walk into store and they could hand that QR code to in-store staff and they would scan it and they would be able to walk the person through the store to look at all of those products. So these connections are incredibly important. And what I would ask is, does your team have the context that they need? Because if you don't have a sense of these important touch points between your app and other channels, it's really hard to do this. And when these experience maps are incomplete or don't exist, you have to ask strategic questions to get the context that you need. And this is where it's getting really weird with those lines blurring. Should your designer do this? Yeah, absolutely. Should your product manager do this? Absolutely. Everyone's getting really busy, and sometimes in teams where we don't have enough resources, this is something you can do on a whiteboard. This isn't an exhaustive process that design has to lead for you to be able to get like a little bit of context and understanding on what to do next. So let's go back to Trello a little bit. This is a husky dog because if you've ever seen the little dog related to Trello, that's Taco, and he was based on a real husky dog. So for us, story-informed strategy. We were using the analogy of trains for deep, heavy work, and mobile as light rail for quick hops and lightweight tasks when away from desk. And instead of trying to replicate the entire train system with rail infrastructure, we focused on those connections. And that informed our planning approach for the app, for prioritization. And this was a collaborative process. What I managed to lead a large portion of this process, but my engineering partner was there, my product partner was there. I invited every EM, and I ran different value proposition sessions where I invited the engineering team to come. I was always very careful that you have a lot of code to write, you have a lot of things going on, you are very busy. I don't expect you to stop doing what you're doing, but I want to invite you that if you are interested in participating, because building shared understanding ultimately speeds teams up. So we prioritized those connections, I've talked about it, but the important part was we got out of the business of prescriptive roadmaps. We said goodbye to sprint reactivity, because we created guiding policies as decision-making guardrails for our teams to be able to make their own autonomous decisions as they're going along, without having to kind of go back and forth and ask for permission on these things. So we decided to focus on experience quality by focusing on the right features. Because if you're trying to chase parity and doing the bare minimum for anything, you never do anything really, really well. So by saying no to a certain number of things, we had the time to do these things right. We also focused on those connections that I've talked about, particularly between platforms and in onboarding. We sketched out features like destination-less content, which is something that you will now see in Trello as the inbox feature. And again, as we talked about that light work, we optimized for those quick sessions. And we invested in native capabilities, which you're like, cool, Caitlin, you're native apps. This was something that Trello had never been able to do once Atlassian bought them, because the focus was on parity for web. And if there was anything we tried to do that web couldn't do, it was like, well, no, we don't have parity. I'm sorry, you can't do that. And by changing this conversation and getting everybody bought in on this new analogy, this new way of prioritizing, we finally had the bandwidth. We were able to invest in these other things, attaching photos and videos, audio content via the share sheet, capturing notes via dictation, iOS-specific features, widgets, shortcuts, handoff, universal links, I don't know, maybe live activities. It was a new thing, and the team was really excited. So you're like, okay, Caitlin, we're a bunch of developers, and you told us a story about you telling stories. Good job. Did it really change anything? It actually did. It really did. Our App Store ratings had been slowly sliding down. And all of a sudden, within 6 months, in 2022, we had the highest App Store ratings that we'd had since 2019 coming in. Code quality shot up. We stopped having an incidents waking people up at 3 a.m. And our engineers were really happy. You could feel this energy in retros, and we saw it in our engagement survey results. Engineers rated team effectiveness as improving from 45% to 89% favorable within 6 months. Work happiness improved from 33% to 78% favorable. Okay, cool, you can make people happy internally. What about your customers? We reached CSAT 91, up through the roof, 7 points higher than Trello's web app. And for context, the average CSAT for work management software in 2022 was 77. And not only did we get up to 91, which we'd already had a pretty high score, we changed the number of extremely satisfied customers from 39% to 46% by pulling up the number of reducing the number of people who were extremely unhappy, and that we were increasing the number of people who were extremely happy from 39% to 46%. We also, users actually discovered and used more features instead of ignoring them. That's that experience quality increasing. So we'd been in negotiations for our login process with web of using auth forever. With the changes that we went through and reframing on this, our new simplified login sign-up flow increased the success rate for authentication by 4.4%. And maybe most importantly was mobile and web started working together on these prioritized features that we thought were the best ones for us to work well together. And for the first time, it felt like we were building one product, not disconnected pieces. So web and native mobile collaborated on advanced checklist notifications, and we saw an 8% increase in paid-enabled users from trials. On a product the size of Trello, those numbers are wild. So this is an example of how shifts in thinking from parity to priorities can help things. And it also shows the importance of understanding your app's place in the device ecosystem. Optimized for what is most important. Strategic thinking helps apps across watch, phone, tablet, desktop, TV, AR, or VR. And a good way to know if you're doing this or not is, are you constantly managing traffic jams? If so, your team may need a story to shape prioritization. It may not be my story, it may not be my analogy, but if you're living in a world where you're being reactive versus proactive, that's not how it has to be. If you've got constant prod incidents, if you're rushing hot fixes, if you've got performance bottlenecks, if you're blocked by another team that doesn't want to talk to you, stories build bridges. So what can you do? Not everybody feels comfortable with storytelling, though I would say it's a skill that all of us can learn because narrative is the human operating system. But here are a few things that you can do. You can ask open-ended questions. Lead with curiosity, not animosity. Hey, I want to make sure I'm building this in a way that aligns with where we're heading. Could you help me understand what other features we might add to this area in the next year? You can connect to immediate benefits. I believe a 30-minute touchpoint mapping session could save us weeks across implementation of this work. Would you be open to exploring potential interaction scenarios with me? Highlight user experience. That's always going to win you points with design and hopefully product, depending on your org. To ensure seamless experiences, it would help to understand how users might interact with this feature in various physical contexts. Could we explore those scenarios together? And share success stories. Remember how our QR code implementation expanded to easily support AR because we planned ahead? I'd like to apply that same forward-thinking approach to this feature. Are we done yet? Almost, because I respect lunch and I respect your time. We started by talking about how we're at an inflection point in our industry. And I've argued that system thinking, like my transit metaphor, can help us navigate this new landscape. Stories are an incredibly part of that process. So, human history. Transformational technologies were not just the technologies themselves, but they were new ways of thinking. The steam engine, the locomotive, that wasn't just a technology. That was a new way of thinking about distance and time. The internet wasn't just a network. It was a new way of thinking about information and connection. And so when we're looking at AI, it is just a technology. And so it means we have to figure out what these new ways of thinking are, what we choose to do with it. I'm going to argue it's a new way of thinking about systems and narrative. Because in a world where anyone can generate code easily, it's developers who are thinking in systems who are going to build the future. And the people creating the narratives may be the ones who are inventing that future. So, thank you. The Thoughtful Apes is my husband Jeff. He spoke yesterday with the management talk. That's kind of where we're going to start publishing more of our tech work. If you're interested in my weird writing about the tech industry and stories and how those things fuse together and what my master's thesis is on, that's what's on caitlinsteele.com. It's not as like tech applicable completely, but I do write about primarily tech and stories together.
All right. I'm happy to do one question before we go to lunch, if anyone has one question. If not, you know, yeah, over there, on the left.
Hello. Thanks, wonderful presentation. I have a question. You know, teams sometimes insert web views inside native apps to like make some shortcuts maybe. What's your opinion on this? How this helps to fight parity?
Ooh, that is a complicated one. I think that there are some times, like say there's an obscure admin function that is incredibly important to have in the app, and there's no way near term you're going to be able to make that investment, but it's a huge unblock for a certain population, like an admin being able to approve a new user. Whatever it is, I would say I could see the arguments for it short term. I do think that long term, it's not a great idea, and anytime you agree to the duct tape fix, it often becomes the permanent duct tape fix that people just keep duct taping over and over and over again, because these days it seems like every time we make compromises, we never have time to go back and do it right.
All right, this seems like a wonderful closing word. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.